I'm Hildy Teagan. I'm the director of the Center for International Business Education and Research here at the George Washington University. I'm also a professor of international affairs in the Elliott School and a professor of international business in the Business School. I'm very, very pleased to join our co-hosts for this event, Women in International Trade, the Washington chapter in particular, on international careers. Our center was founded in October of this past year with funding from the U.S. Department of Education, Title VI program, to promote U.S. competitiveness. One way that we think that we can do a good job in promoting business competitiveness for U.S. individuals and U.S. firms is by getting students and young professionals like yourselves more interested in pursuing international careers. Our particular cyber focuses on the theme of institutions and development. Given the expertise that we have on our campus and given our DC location, it's a natural one for us to work on. And we join the other 30 cybers in this national network in our research, outreach, and educational activities. And I'm pleased to report that we'll be taping this session so that our colleagues at other centers around the country, as well as other chapters within the WIT network, can enjoy the expertise provided by our panelists here today. You'll notice that our panelists, although all of them have had very successful and interesting international careers, many of them have also worked in areas that are very consistent with our theme of institutions and development. Again, today's event would not have been possible without the generous co-hosting of our colleagues at WIT, and we also have other co-sponsors that I'd like to thank who have been very instrumental in making sure that this panel could happen today. We've been able to rely on the expertise and the guidance of various career centers here on the George Washington University campus, at the School of Public Policy and Public Affairs, at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and the School of Business. And we're also joined by two student organizations here on campus, Net Impact and the Organization for International Development. We're very pleased to collaborate with them on this initiative and look forward to other opportunities in the future. Please stay with us not only through the event, obviously, but join us afterwards for a networking reception upstairs that's right up and outside the door here, where you'll have an opportunity to meet with some of the panelists and with some of your colleagues here today. I'd like to now introduce our moderator, Dr. Liesl Riddle, my colleague in International Business and International Affairs here at GW, who also serves, wearing one of her multiple hats, as the GW-CIBER Faculty Coordinator for Careers. She's an award-winning teacher, an active researcher on development, and has had a very successful career prior to her life in academia. I know that she's prepared some thought-provoking questions to get our panelists engaged, and I know that she'll preserve plenty of time for all of you to be able to engage in getting your own questions answered of this wonderful panel that we have with us today. Thank you all for joining us in this event, and I look forward to meeting some of you personally in the reception afterwards.
We are so lucky to have such an accomplished and talented panel speaking to us tonight. One of the greatest challenges I've faced in preparing for this event was looking at their very lengthy and very accomplished biographies that are sitting in most of your laps right now and trying to figure out just what are just a couple of bullet points as a means of introduction for each one of them. So I'll do my best to briefly cover their accomplishments. We'll start first, we'll go from the left around to the right in the shoehorn that we have here. We have first Jennifer Bindhammer. She has a BA in International Studies and an MBA. She recently launched Jeunesse International, an advisory firm focused on supporting small and medium-sized new businesses. Her previous experience includes positions at an international nonprofit, development and aid organization, a major U.S. airline, and a leading aviation consulting firm. Then we have next Amanda DeBusk, who received her BA from Richmond University and a JD from Harvard Law School. She is the chair of the International Trade Group at Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, LLP, one of the top 100 law firms based in the United States. She is the former Commerce Department Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement. She was also a commissioner on the Federal Interagency Commission on Crime and Security at the seaports. Next, we have Jennifer Mulvaney, who has a BA in Political Science and English and a master's degree in International Relations from GW. She is the Director of Trade and Legislative Affairs at Sandler, Travis & Rosenberg, representing clients on trade issues before the White House, the federal government agencies, etc. She is the former Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Congressional Affairs and has also worked on the staff of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Next, we have Dr. Ronnie Parker. She has a BA in economics, master's degree in international economic relations, and a PhD from GW in public administration. She is the founder of Business Community Synergies, which is a consulting company that works with MNCs and local communities to promote sustainable development. Her research on corporate community relationships spans public-private business, civil society sectors as well. She's the former director of Women Child Impact Programs and chief advisor at Save the Children. And last but not least, our single male on the panel, Aaron Williams, who is a graduate of Chicago State University and who also has an MBA. He is Vice President for International Business Development at the Research Triangle Institute. He has over 25 years experience in policy formulation, strategic planning, and implementation of development assistance programs. He was awarded USAID's Distinguished Career Service Award and the Presidential Award for Distinguished Service. So please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel tonight. So my first question for the panelists. Looking back on your very distinguished careers in the international arena, what would you say was the greatest challenge that you faced and the greatest reward? We'll start with you, Jennifer.
When I got the question from Dr. Riddle, I have to say it surprised me because I'm used to thinking very much in a project mode. So I had to step back a little bit. And the thing that struck me and the biggest challenge that I've had has been not taking my career for granted. The places I've visited, the skills I've gained, the people I've talked to, it's very easy to forget the breadth and the depth of knowledge that you get through each project, each conversation, each minute you spend working on one more proposal. And you have to consciously take time, whether it be every few months, whether it be once a year, however that happens, to audit what's happened over the year and really take stock of what you are gaining in your position, whether it be in a position that you plan on staying with for a while or in a position that you're looking at moving through. I think the biggest reward, for me, that was twofold. First, for the adventure. I'm an adventurer at heart, and I will go anywhere, anytime. I have no problems packing my bags for 3 weeks and heading off to Kuwait. I don't think twice. The second thing for me was the privilege of having worked with the people that I've worked with. When I worked for the International Development Organization, I worked with the poorest of the poor. I was invited into homes that could not afford to feed their families, but they were feeding us. And I've worked with royalty and having to deal with their entourages and having to present the organization to them in such a manner that would lend them understanding in the areas that they worked in. I think those are the two primary rewards.
Amanda?
Sure. For me, I'll answer the question on a really personal level. My biggest challenge has been juggling being a wife and mom with my job. I have 3 kids. I have one child who was born right after I became a partner at a law firm, and then I have twins, and the twins were born when I was an assistant secretary at the Commerce Department. So having sort of a big job and twins, that was, thankfully I also have a wonderful husband and help. So that has certainly been a challenge, and it's a challenge that doesn't go away. The kids are a little bit older now. They're still young. My oldest is 12 and my twins are 8 now. So that's still a challenge in terms of trying to handle the job and the family. And I guess my husband gets the short end of the stick there. In terms of the rewards I've had is I've loved every job I've had. I have had a lot of different jobs, but they've all revolved around international trade. And here in Washington, it's such a wonderful place to be involved in trade. I've always been involved in projects that have the legal aspect and the public policy aspect. and also the congressional aspect and public relations aspects all rolled into one. So every day of my job, it's been fun projects and really interesting work. So that's been my greatest reward.
I would say my biggest challenge is probably something that I think everyone in this room has dealt with at one point in time and will continue to deal with regardless of whether it's your career or personal ventures, and that is really maintaining a degree of confidence in what you're doing. I think it's easy kind of when you're in graduate school and you're going through the grind of going to your lectures and taking your notes and regurgitating them on an exam, but when you get out into the real world, it's tough to really maintain a confidence that you really know what you know and you have what it takes to truly have a career, to launch a career and maintain a career and put creative ideas on the table. And that took me a while to come to terms with, that I do have a lot in my brain to offer. It's not about going to a meeting on Capitol Hill and remembering what a congressman said and then spitting that back out to your boss. You have to kind of think outside the box and use that information to help your career and help wherever it is you're working at the time. And my reward has been really somewhat related to that, and that is that I basically have been working with the Congress and doing lobbying since I graduated from undergrad degree, and I worked while I was here at GW. And it's easy to get labeled, especially these days in Washington, as a lobbyist, and that being kind of a questionable career. But really, I think it's a lot more than what I think that the Washington Post would describe a lobbyist as these days. It really is an educator, and it really is someone who does truly contribute to creating good policy in Washington, good or bad, I guess, whatever way you look at it. But that's been rewarding to me, is to take the time to explain to members of Congress or people in the administration what it means to do X or Y policy and the repercussions and the consequences that will have on whether it's a country or a company or a group of people in Montana. That's been very rewarding for me.
And I'm still not getting ideas about the biggest challenge, because when I think challenge, it's always intensely personal. My professional life has been great to me. I am have been going back, as my colleagues have been speaking, really to when I was a new immigrant in this country. Perhaps that's where I would place the biggest challenge as a teenager. In my family, people said, oh, Ronnie's good at whatever it was. I've now forgotten what it was that I was supposed to do, but it wasn't to found and run a business, I'm sure. One day somebody asked me what I really wanted to do, and I said, oh, I think I'm going to be a whatever. And he said, this is a neighbor or some family friend. He said, no, but what would you really like to do? And he pressed me and he pressed me and he pressed me, and I said, oh, I would love to travel and see the world. And some months later, he said, well, I was so fascinated by your interest in seeing the world. What are you doing about it? Or something more polite, I'm sure. Well, it was then that it occurred to me that he really believed that I was going to do what I really wanted to do. And that was very powerful for me, just realizing, coming to terms with the reality of doing what I've wanted to do. And indeed, I have traveled very extensively over the course of the last 20, more than that, years. And from that has come what I would say is the biggest reward. Again, I set aside family here because my daughter comes to mind, because we couldn't find a babysitter today, and I'm thinking about what she's doing. But the biggest reward from all this travel is that I've gotten to know people of different, with different sets of choices than I've had. And they've very much influenced my choices, personally and professionally. So I guess that's sort of a broad challenge and reward, and I'll stop there.
It's hard to come behind these four accomplished people after describing the wonderful things of challenges them and rewarded them. I guess one of the greatest rewards that I've had in my life, one of the great privileges, was to be a Peace Corps volunteer. I went to the Peace Corps in the 60s, and some of the first Peace Corps volunteers in the Dominican Republic. I served there for 3 years. I met my wife there, and she, of course, has contributed to making my life what it is today. We have 2 wonderful sons. That's also a very, very rewarding part of our life. And they've had a chance to experience the world and travel with us throughout my career. But the Peace Corps really set everything in motion. I was a high school teacher in Chicago when I went to the Peace Corps. It turned my life completely around. I'm doing things now that I never even envisioned when I was a high school teacher in Chicago. Changed my life forever, as they say in the Peace Corps. The other thing that's been very rewarding for me, or one of the most rewarding things that I've done in my career when I worked at the Agency for International Development, is I led the aid program in South Africa during the administration of President Nelson Mandela. That was an extraordinary opportunity, both to work there, to live in South Africa, to have my family there and experience being in that transforming society, to be able to work with people of the stature of Nelson Mandela and his cabinet and his colleagues both in civil society and government, to see them actually transform a country, to really focus on what was important for every South African citizen, no matter what color they were, no matter what race, religion they were determined to make that a different country. That was an extraordinary period of time. In terms of challenges, I think the most challenging thing that I've faced in my life from a standpoint of my work has been the work I've been doing for the last 4 years in trying to help reconstruct Iraq. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, during the course of our conversation. But the scope and magnitude of the Iraq reconstruction, something that the world has never seen since the Marshall Plan. For us in my company at Research Triangle Institute, RTI, we were tasked with trying to assist the local governments and provincial councils in Iraq. We had a nationwide program. I've traveled all over Iraq to all the cities and the provinces and trying to work with some very talented Iraqi citizens who are trying to transform their country. All the things you've read about in the newspaper, part of them are true, some of them are not true, but the fact of the matter is that Iraq and trying to transform that country has been the most challenging thing that I've faced in my career up to this point in time.
Thank you very much. The next question I have for you is, each one of you at some point in time did a master's degree, like many of our audience members, in something that's international related, whether it was international affairs, international economics, or an MBA with somewhat of an international focus. Can you take us back in time and sort of think about how did that graduate degree, that master's degree in particular, or your subsequent degrees, really change the way you thought about your career plans, your career path? Like being with you, Jennifer?
Sure. I think for me, it wasn't necessarily a change or a digression or a rabbit trail, if you will, to my career plans. It just seemed a natural fit. I knew that where I was at the time, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, it was just after September 11th when I made the decision to go. And working for an airline at the time, my life changed. And so that process was kickstarted. And in the process of going to work one morning, I had this idea. Why don't I go to business school? And suddenly what had seemed like a crazy conversation just a few months earlier with someone suddenly became very real. By the end of that year, I was sitting in a classroom. I still cannot tell you how. Sitting in a classroom, and it was just a natural fit. It worked for everything that I had accomplished and for everything that I wanted to do in the future. I knew there was knowledge I needed, and I saw it as another foundational piece. It was one more brick in the foundation before I started putting the walls up.
Sure. I would say that if I look back on, when I was in this spot that many in the audience are, still in school or thinking about next steps, I really had no idea where I would be. And I think you need to have sort of a solid educational background, but then just follow opportunities wherever they might lead. Nothing is static, particularly in the job market. Nothing is ever static with companies. The first law firm I was with, well, my goodness, no one told me about, law firm split-offs, right? And so when that came, you just, you had to make a choice and decide what to do. And so you can't really focus too much on sort of over-planning from where you are, but just try to do a good job, and whatever job is your first job, and that will lead you to progression within that job or to another opportunity.
I think for me, it was also kind of a natural fit. I've always enjoyed school, and I think coming to moving to Washington was a big step for me coming from a small town, and I think it provided a degree of structure, so it was kind of a natural place for me to move and take the next step to go to graduate school. And I was actually working full-time while I was here at GW, which was another challenge that I had in the past. But I don't regret that at all. To me, it was a nice blend of two different worlds, and I have continued to maintain that to this day. And I think that has helped me realize that it is important to have kind of a diversity of worlds in your life, even when you do start your career and as you maintain your career. I do still enjoy very much doing events like this. It kind of, we were talking earlier before we started up here about how it was a nice kind of break in the day. You're kind of cranking through your day, doing the emails and the phone calls, and it's nice to sit down and think about questions like this to answer tonight, and I really enjoy that. I've done a lot of guest lecturing at Princeton, here at GW, and at Georgetown. I enjoy doing that because of then, again, it forces me to kind of take a step away from my daily job and think about things in a different light. And I do a lot of volunteering as well. That's another world that I kind of like to mix into what I do on a daily basis. And I think that that's very important. So while I try to keep up with the academic side of international trade, which is what I do, it's hard to do that on a daily basis because you're so ensconced in your professional world, serving clients and running them back and forth to the Hill and the White House. But I think it's important to maintain a very diverse perspective on what you do on a daily basis. I think it keeps you fresh. Yeah, I think it's critical.
I was very confused coming out of graduate school, and I was trying to remember why I went to begin with, because I had a job and I was fine. And I think my husband at the time was not my husband at the time.
It's true.
I think my husband influenced me because he was going to law school and he kept saying, "Oh, why don't you apply to Fletcher? Why don't you? Why don't you?" And he sort of pushed me. And then when the acceptance came, I said, "No, you know, I'm not getting into debt. I don't really need this. I have a job." In my family, a government job is a very, very big deal. Lots of the traditional families in India, at least before the boom, the recent boom happened in those days, government job was a big deal. And I had my federal government job at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I said, but then he said, "Well, you know, just write them a letter then and tell them that you need money." So I said, okay, and I wrote them a letter and said, yes, I would like to come, but I plan to work in public service, and I don't know why I said that. I said public service, and I won't be able to repay loans, so I don't have the money. And they wrote back, and I got a fellowship that happened to exist for people wanting to go into public service that somebody else had rejected. So there I was in graduate school, and it worked out personally well, but then I didn't know what to do. I stumbled into the international development work and found myself at Save the Children. I think I did that partly because one thing that the experience at graduate school did for me was that it gave me confidence. It convinced me that, you know, I was going to the Fletcher School, and whatever, I took a class at Harvard Law School with some other people who struck me as being very bright. And then I saw what they were learning, and I thought, well, wait a minute, I can do this. So when I came out of graduate school, I didn't have much of a sense about career, but I had tremendous self-confidence. I felt like I could do the work, whatever was given to me. Oh.
What? No, I'm sorry, please.
I didn't mention the doctorate because I did it right here in this building, and that was life-changing. That was later. That was life-changing. I just finished in 2003, I think. And it really did. The faculty here, I came here to reflect from almost, I would say like 18, 20 years of experience working in international development with NGOs. I came here to reflect, to find new ways to do my work, go back with new ideas, and I never went back.
Well, I was an educator. I taught high school in Chicago, and then I went to the Peace Corps, and I was a teacher trainer in the Peace Corps. But when I left the Peace Corps really opened up a whole new expanse to me. I decided I needed to change my life. I wanted to do something different. So I said, I need to go to graduate school, and I want to get a graduate degree, but I don't want to stay in education. I want an all-purpose degree that's going to give me lots of options in terms of career development in the future. And I had a thought that I wanted to try to work in business and I wanted at some point in time to try to work in government. So I decided that instead of getting a master's in public administration, or I was also thinking about urban planning, I decided to get an MBA. And this was something that was very strange in my family because no one had really worked in business before. We were civil servants, many generations, or teachers. And it was a big surprise when I ended up landing a fellowship. It was a surprise to me at the University of Wisconsin, which turned out to be a marvelous place. And I studied international business and marketing there. And I came in contact with lots of people, lots of different backgrounds, and people who had degrees in business and at the undergraduate level. And so I had to really dig in and study hard to move into this new field. But I really liked it. I enjoyed it. And it led to a wonderful career with a couple of Fortune 500 companies after I got out of graduate school, and that really gave me a different perspective. It meshed very nicely, strangely as it may seem, with my international experience in the Peace Corps. And it was really another education. Working for a Fortune 500 corporation is like getting another education because the discipline, the focus, the skills, the teamwork is really extraordinary. So for me, an MBA turned out to be the best possible thing I could have done because it's allowed me to move very easily between government, the nonprofit sector, and the business world.
That leads into my next question. I mean, if you look at the impressive biographies in the collection, it reveals a very interesting pattern among these folks. That most of them, at some point in their career, moved from one sector to the other. They were either working in the public sector and then went to private, working in an NGO, then working over in the private, or went to the government sector. And so I have a lot of questions sort of around that, because I know that many of our students are interested, trying to make decisions, what's the best sort of next step for me after the degree, but also thinking about career pathing issues. What particular challenges, if any, have you experienced as a result of sort of that transition, moving from one sector to the other in your careers? Jennifer?
You know, giving some thought to that question, and we had a bit of a cheat sheet before we came, so we had to spend some time thinking about this. And there will always be challenges, and there will always be someone who says no. And there will always be someone who says, you can't. But I'm sitting here and I'm telling you, yes, and you can. I have to be honest. With my personality and the way I am, I don't take no for an answer. I don't like no. If you tell me no, I will figure out a way to do it. It may not be with you, but it will get done, and you will find out about it. And I had someone throw a gauntlet down when I was in grad school. And it was the first time I had ever really faced someone looking me in the eye and saying, you can't do what you want to do. You can't make that switch. I'm sorry? What do you mean, no? And it took a little over a year, and I made the switch. So I would say to you and encourage you, don't take no. Don't allow someone to say you can't, because you can. The question is, what does the end result look like? It may not look like the original plan, but you can do this. You can make any change that you need to make. You can make the switch. And whether that involves, volunteering for a while, or joining the Peace Corps, or looking for and seizing opportunity and creating opportunity to make that switch, then do it. I wish I could spend more time talking with you all about that, because there is so much to say, but that is my primary thing. Don't take no. Because if I don't take no, there's no reason for you to take no for an answer.
For myself, I've made the transition several times. I started out in the private sector, and then I went to government, and then I went back to the private sector. So starting out in the private sector, I had a lot of student loans. I hadn't known about these fellowships like you, Randy. That's right, exactly. So my choice was private sector or private sector. So I started started in the private sector, and that was, you know, it was great. But then when you switch from the private sector over to the government, that's really quite a switch, because you're used to sort of office environment. You know, you can hire, you can fire, you can buy your new software program, you can use a consultant, you cannot use a consultant. You have just a lot of independence and a lot of autonomy. And so then you go into the government, and then all of a sudden you're in charge of budgets with lots of zeros after them, and hundreds of people, and field offices spread out around the country. And so it's very, very different sorts of organizational challenges that you have in the government. And then, of course, all the responsibilities of, well, I'm doing something that matters, I better get it right. It's like it's not just a stack of money that gets shifted around from this group to that group. In my particular case, it was a national security-based portfolio, so you had that sort of weight upon your shoulders. And then you lacked the incentives that you have in the private sector. You can't fire anybody, you can't reward the good people. You know, you give them a couple $1,000s or something like that, not the big pot that, you know, that is meaningful in the private sector. You have to incentivize them without money. You have to find other ways to incentivize them. So that was quite a challenge. Then coming back to the private sector was quite a challenge, because you're used to running a large organization and never writing anything longer than one page, and then all of a sudden you have to flip the light switch, and it's like, my God, it's 50 pages and I even have to read the footnotes. I don't have a designated reader anymore, you know. So you have to make the switch back, which is, again, an interesting sort of challenge to be able to go back into the private sector. A lot of people aren't able to sort of switch back. They've gotten used to one style or the other, and they're very different styles. But it's also very energizing. It makes you think in new ways, fun ways. It's good for the brain cells when you're switching back and forth from one type of job to another.
I would echo Amanda's last statement strongly, and that is that it does keep you, it keeps you energized, it keeps you fresh. I'm 32 years old, and I've gone from government to private sector, government back to the private sector again. So I've done, I think I've averaged maybe 2 or 3 years per job, and I've loved it. I really have not found that many challenges. Now, granted, I haven't made a full-on career switch. I haven't started my own business, but I have kind of stayed in the international trade world, just putting on different hats. I think probably that the biggest challenge that I had was going to work for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where I was appointed by the White House for my position, so I had to really wear a political hat. And that has its days where you feel very limited, because you can't say always what you want to say, you can't always do what you want to do, because you're kind of in the confines of this new world. And you have to think about, you know, the larger political ramifications of what you say and what you do. When I was going to Capitol Hill and talking to the private sector, you have to be very careful. And there's things that you can't do as an agency, because the White House has a different agenda than you may have that day. I'm working international trade. The president is working on making sure that, you know, he keeps his political goals in line, and that can sometimes make your job a little bit difficult. But at the same time, that is the way Washington works, and I think I quickly became acclimated to that world. And I just kind of lived in the parameters that I had to deal with. But that was a little bit challenging for me. Someone who's very outspoken and had to, you know, kind of be careful about what I said and did, and think carefully about what the consequences could be. But going back to the private sector, I agree. It was very liberating. You feel like you kind of be your own person, and you don't realize how much you learned in the government until you get back to the private sector, and you're called upon for your expertise on the kinds of things that you learned in the government in terms of creating policy, and it really just kind of sticks with you. And again, it goes back to my first statement about confidence, is that you think you don't know it, but you actually do. And it just kind of takes a few years of experience. For me, it's only, you know, I've had a relatively short career in Washington of 10 years, but I've learned so much with every job that I've had, and it kind of all blends together at the end, and every experience kind of makes for a very valuable career.
I think that although I've switched, I think that I probably have spent the bulk of my career working with non-governmental organizations, small ones, bigger, until Save the Children. and then organizations involved in international development. My view on this sector thing is that it's all getting very blurred, very, very blurry now. I run my own small business. We do work with mining companies and oil and gas companies. And, you know, I go there and I see people. I just spoke with someone this afternoon, an anthropologist in a mining company, because they were talking about community relationships. So the world really is very open. And I think that I would give the advice that I gave to myself, which did cause moments of stress, which was to go and do my own thing. Financially, it's much better to find your own thing in somebody else's shop, because you get a regular paycheck that way. But I think as long as there's something, I personally don't think it matters that much. I wasn't a senior enough official in government to have any influence at the Bureau of Labor Statistics where I was. I found all of the jobs that I was in to be a lot of fun. I was very fortunate that I had good personal relationships in those many jobs. And I think I had those because in each of those jobs there was something there that was challenging and right to me. And looking back on it, I think every single one of those jobs had sort of a yucky side to it, something that I really didn't like, but there it was. And now I love what I do now, which is to run my own company, but it has its hassles as well, in addition to not getting a regular paycheck. But I love the independence. However, after having gone through this reflection in my PhD process, I feel ready to be independent. I feel ready to sort of have my own position that I can, I want to say sell in a polite way, but the word sell is what comes to me. My position. In terms of international development, the kind of work that I do, I don't think that really one ought to go into it unless it's very personal, unless you can really listen very, very, very well. And if you like to listen, and if you're taken with other people's lives, then, you know, I think it's fine whether you do it with your mining client who might be a large multinational company, or whether you do it with Oxfam as we did recently. Our report is outside if you'd like, if people are interested in Oxfam or mining. Or if you do it in government. Well, government may be different. I don't know. I'll stop there.
You know, when Jennifer said that one should never take no for an answer, I really subscribe to that theory. And in government, people often think that government is very bureaucratic, lots of rules and regulations, and people telling you can only do things a certain way. I always fought to be entrepreneurial in government. As a matter of fact, when I interviewed for one of my jobs in the nonprofit world, the president of one of these organizations told me, he says, you know, we're really concerned about bringing you in because you've had 20 years of experience in government, and we're not sure if you can move quickly the way we do in the private sector in this nonprofit world. I said, see, that just goes to show that you don't understand how someone can be entrepreneurial in government, because if you did, you wouldn't have been concerned about that if you looked at my track record and what I've done. But I always tried to be entrepreneurial. I never accepted no for an answer. I developed the teams and the network needed to actually make a difference and to change things and to create new initiatives. I also was one of the first to raise my hand and say, I'll take on this challenge, this new assignment, this dirty job that nobody else wants to take on, because I figured, number one, first one through the door defines the job. If you're successful, you're going to get a lot of praise and support for doing it, and you're going to learn a lot, and probably it's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to develop some tremendous teams. So I always believed in being entrepreneurial in government. Then I found out when I switched over to the nonprofit world and in the business world, it worked very, very well to use those same skills to be entrepreneurial and to develop a basis for trying to effectuate change within those organizations. The other thing, a lot of the skills that I learned in business, skills I learned in government, really came into play when I worked for a small foundation called the International Youth Foundation. I was asked to come and create their first global partnership program with companies like Nokia, American Express, British Airways, Merrill Lynch, etc. And by tapping into this new wave of corporate social responsibility, I found it was a place to perfectly blend the skills that I picked up in government and business and in the nonprofit world.
I think if I can add something to what Erin has to say as well, there will be times when you accept no for an answer, and it may be a few months later that you realize you're doing that. That's part of the process. True confessions. There was a time period where I took no for an answer for probably almost 3 years. And I woke up one morning realizing that that was happening. And so I stood up for myself and I said, you know what, I'm done. And I can't take no anymore. And that led to some pretty significant changes in my career. You may find yourself in those situations, and that's okay. It's being able to recognize that, stay true to who you are, what your goals are, what you are wanting from your career, from your life, and embracing the opportunity that comes, whether it be a challenge. You know, after all, the challenge is what? An opportunity with work clothes on? Isn't that what they say? And so you've got to be willing to allow yourself those moments when that happens, because it will happen. You just need to learn to recognize it before it controls you for longer than needs be.
All of you have had exposure to many different types of cultural environments through your international work. And so I'm wondering, has there ever been any kind of experience that you've had that really surprised you in the international arena? You know, we try so hard in our careers to control, but often through our career experiences, something happens that sort of takes us by surprise, especially I think in the international arena. So I'm wondering if you might have some experiences to share along those lines.
Where do I start? The day that I possibly ate bush rat and didn't find out about it until afterwards? Or sitting in this gentleman's home we were working in Cotonou, Benin at the time in West Africa. And we had been invited to lunch. And that's great. I have an hour. I can stretch it to an hour and a half. No problem. I was working in marketing and communications at the time for this organization. We had projects going on. Wonderful. A group of us had been invited. 3 hours later, we were still sitting in this gentleman's home, and we were just getting started. And he kept pulling out more food and more food. And he honestly was giving us everything he had. And I have to be honest, we took that for granted. And looking back at it, I wish we hadn't. I wish we had spent more time. I wish we had talked more, because he was offering everything he had. And that is so unusual in today's world. And in our culture, we're very business oriented. We're very fast. It was a surprise for me to learn in many cultures, it's socializing first, business second. You know, with the exception of a couple. You know, they want to know about your families. They want to know. Your colleagues will want to know. You know, are you married? Do you have children? Do you travel much? What do you know about their culture? What do you want to know? And then get down to business. It's discovering that relationship was more important than the business was huge.
For me, one of the things that I hadn't really anticipated is that there's still a lot of barriers to being a female in business and being the one who's the boss. This is, I was dealing with people in an Asian country, and I was the boss, and I had a man working underneath me. And so we would be dealing with the client, and then every day the communication would come back to him. And I kept going, why are they sending it to him? And then finally the light bulb goes on. It's like, aha, they're sending it to him because he's the man. They don't understand letterhead order, They had just automatically assumed that the person that they should direct their communications to was the man, not the woman. And so in some cultures, I think there's still a lot of that, and it's something that you just have to be sensitized to. It's something that you can generally get beyond, but sometimes, even in this day and age, you still find those attitudes and all that pose impediments.
I think the thing that has surprised me most is how much other people from other countries and other governments know about the United States. I think we know we live in a very international city, maybe one of the most international cities in the world, being in Washington, D.C., where we do know a lot about other cultures just by our neighbors and by the people we see in our office buildings every day. I think we don't realize how much people, even when they come from abroad, even if it's for a week or so to visit Washington, really do know about our government and how we work. I just find it absolutely fascinating, and sometimes I feel a little bit intimidated. I have a lot of clients that are from other countries, and what we have them do, especially if there's a trade agreement coming up, we have them come over to Washington from Bogota, Colombia, or from Peru to actually help lobby on behalf of their government for that trade agreement in the Congress. And they walk up and down the halls of the Congress and walk into a member's office and sit down and explain why that trade agreement is important for their country. And I can't imagine if I was sent to Bogota, Colombia, and had to walk the halls of the Colombian Congress and explain to Colombian members why it was important for them to do something for me. But these folks really come to Washington, and they know so much. They ask a lot of questions. They're not afraid to ask questions. But they really come armed with the tools. A lot of it is they just speak from the heart and why something is important. But they also really have done their homework, and they know how our government works, and they're very intrigued with how open it is. Again, you go back to how lobbying kind of gets a bad rap around here, but I think we also have an advantage of having the halls of Congress where you can walk in and sit down with a member of Congress, regardless of where you're from, and tell your story. I mean, I found that very surprising, but in a pleasant way.
I think I'll actually make it personal. I think the thing that surprised me the most was really myself, that I would never have imagined that I would work with large corporations. I grew up in the activist, non-governmental world, and we hated all organizations, all big companies. They robbed from the poor and gave to the rich, etc. You know the story. So the idea that I would really ever do this kind of work would have been impossible to conceive even in my 30s. It was actually the doctoral program, that period of reflection, that really changed my views about a lot of things. So I think there's a big lesson here about the fact that we live so long these days, and there's a lot of time in our lives, and there's space for change, and it's more and more acceptable to do different things. And so it's less important what you do at the start, in the sense that, you can always go back and fix it. So I think that it's, don't underestimate a change. And when people, graduate students, come to talk to me about jobs, part of what I say is that, you don't have to have the answer to start your job. And certainly in my case, when I started working for the American federal government, I thought I had it made for life. And in fact, it's gone all over the place since then. And I think that's been a good thing. So that is certainly very, very, I would not have believed it. The options, I think, in developing countries also are changing tremendously. I really hear what you say about being a woman boss, and particularly in the poorer countries. Just imagine that, except you're small and dark and female, and you've got this white male with you. Certainly, someday when I retire, I can write a book about those stories. But I really think those things, the options are changing. But those things are still happening, and they're happening here too, not just in developing countries. I think it's really important to let those things pass. Otherwise, you'll become a very angry old person.
For me, one of the great surprises that I continue to find everywhere I travel in the world is the great potential of youth. Young people in every country of the world, no matter how poor, how oppressed, how many challenges they face, they continue to have this great untapped optimism about the future if they have opportunities. And so I've tried more and more in my work, I've tried to skew my work more and more every day towards trying to find ways to create more opportunities for young people in every continent in the world. And fortunately, I work for a company where we have a pretty broad global reach, and we can reach a lot of different young people through lots of different ways and programs. And that's one of the big surprises that I find. No matter how many obstacles and problems they face, and these new ferocious problems like HIV/AIDS that we didn't have to face when I was young, people continue to have, among the young people, continue to find this great optimism about the future if in fact they have opportunities and they can connect with people in their society or from outside their society who want to make a difference for them. That continues to be a wonderful source of pleasant surprise to me.
Well, next what I'd like to do is move into the question and answer portion of the program. As you can see to the far sides of the stage here, we have microphones that are set up. What I'd like to ask audience members who have questions that you'd like to pose to our very distinguished panels, if you could come around the sides, not walk down the center aisle, but come around the sides, if you will, and queue up in front of the microphones, and then I'll look to you and call on you as we go through the Q&A portion. As you all are lining up and queuing up to talk to our panel, I'll just pose my very last question, which is many of you are hiring managers or have been at some point in time a hiring manager, and you've had to assess the potential and the background of a master's level candidate, as many of our audience members are. And what I'd like to hear from you a little bit is, do you have any tips for our students out there about how to find a job, how to present themselves well? Can you give us some of your knowledge and experience on that topic, please?
I think first and foremost, build your brand. Coming out of a marketing and communications background, each of you has a brand. When you call someone, when you walk into their office for an interview, everything about you is speaking that brand. Make sure that your brand is consistent. Everything that you're projecting, everything that you're saying, everything that you're presenting and discussing needs to revolve around that brand. What are you trying to accomplish, and why are you my best answer? I think second is, well, let me start by saying my favorite story. I received a phone call from a young woman not too long ago from someone in an associated firm. At the time I was working for a consulting firm, and as we got to talking, I realized she didn't know anything about my company. She didn't know anything about the consulting firm. She didn't know anything about what we did, and yet we had been cohorts on projects before. And we're having this conversation, and it comes out that she had just downloaded the association directory, and sent out resumes and cover letters to all of these groups without knowing who they were or why she was sending them. Please don't do that. It seems obvious, but I was so embarrassed for her. I spent the next couple of days trying to work with her to get her on track, because I didn't want her faced with someone else who could potentially destroy what I sensed was a tenuous situation. So really know who you're speaking to. It's not hard anymore. It can get overwhelming, I know. It can be very overwhelming. It can be scary. But you're there for a reason, because you believe that you are their best answer. And so make sure that you're communicating that brand and why you think you're their best answer.
When there are students that are interviewing for entry-level positions, what we look for is someone who's done their homework about the company or about the government, office, when I was in government. So the key is to research the organization where you are applying for the job. And to the extent that you know who you're going to be interviewing, you also research that person. There's lots of information out there, on the internet about the many people that you would be interviewing at the company. And so the more that you can address the, why it goes to the same point about branding, why you are the right person for that particular employer. That's what I think the employer finds very persuasive.
I think it I agree with Jennifer a lot on the branding issue, but I know when I first came out of school, branding myself was, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. Like, this is my name, this is where I went to school, this was my major, that's all I know. I don't know how else to brand myself. So it's intimidating, especially when you're first starting out after school. I think the advice that I give people most is also based on some of my own personal experience and talking to folks from GW and from Women International Trade that are looking for a job. And that is, it's very difficult to give advice to someone if they come to you and say, I have no idea what I want to do with my life. It's like, okay, well, let's start from square one. You know, where were you born? What do you like to do? I mean, you've got to have something to start with based on your interests. Either it's something that you're studying in your classes that you find interesting, someone that you met at a coffee shop last week, you thought their job was interesting, and just something where you can at least start a conversation to show that you do have some interest and you've at least thought about how to hone down what you're looking for. And it may be very broad, but it just helps to kind of keep the conversation moving and to help me help you if I have some sense of the kinds of things you're looking for. And I know that's hard in Washington because there's so much to choose from. But again, I think you can do your homework on that as well. I happen to be a big advocate of doing something while you're going to school. I don't think it's feasible for everyone to work full time. I think that's extremely difficult to do. I know it was very challenging for me to do that. But if you can find something, if you can't find something in this town to do either on a very, very part-time basis, one afternoon a week, you know, a couple of evenings a week, where you can just get a sense of what it is that's out there. And I know for me it was helpful to do that because I needed to eliminate all the options. You know, do I have an interest in working for an association, working for a nonprofit, working at a school, working for the government? You've got to start narrowing that down or you're going to be awfully overwhelmed when it comes time to figure out what it is you want to do. So that would be my advice.
I would certainly support the homework thing. And I always ask people, because we're so small, but I think I used to ask this even at Save the Children. I would say, what is it about us that's interesting to you? And you really need to personalize that. And I think for me, that's the judgment question. What is it? It's not, I took this course, usually wouldn't cut it. It would have to be something more that would show me that there's some passion about it. And the other thing is that because in all my jobs, I've worked in very sort of high stress environments, because when you're in an international, when you're working, when poor people are involved, you know, there's always somehow more, it's hard. I always look for people with a positive outlook. You know, someone who can really take a situation and in the worst case scenario, laugh rather than cry. So I look for that as well. Someone who I think generally has sort of a positive attitude, would be fun to have as a colleague, would be someone not complaining, not overly contrary. Not to say that, you know, you shouldn't disagree, but I have encountered and worked with people who seem much more somehow able to cope in a positive way. Everybody has problems, but being able to, maybe the solution is that if you have the passion around it, then you're much more inclined to cope. I look for that as well. But certainly if you don't do the homework, it's really a problem. I've actually been, I've hung up on people who have made a phone appointment with me and then called me, and then it's very clear they have no idea what we do. I say, well, what is it about our company that interested you? And I can hear them just not having any clue at all. And then I've hung up. I'm usually not that rude. And I personally have a policy, because I've held many different, I've changed jobs a lot, much like you. I have a policy of always responding to anybody who wants to talk with me about jobs. It might take a long time to do so, but I always do schedule a time, and I try to respect that in person or by phone.
This is the most competitive job market anywhere, probably in the world. There's a lot of outstanding schools in this market. There's a lot of very articulate, well-prepared, well-educated young people vying to get jobs in this exciting, vibrant market. So you're facing a real tough battle in trying to sell yourselves to a new employer. What I try to do, besides, I agree with everything else that my colleagues said today on the panel about obviously you want somebody to walk into your office as well prepared, understands your business and what your company does. But what I want to know is, I always ask the question about, tell me your story. Why do you think that this is a place or the type of field that you want to work in? Tell me your story. Explain it to me. Break it down so I understand why you think this is right for you. And I don't expect a person to be an expert of what we do if they're just starting out. But I want to know what their motives are. I want to know what they think they can contribute. And I want to try to find, because if you give me that information, that can help you think through whether this is the right place for you, maybe it's the wrong place for you, but at least let's find some common ground. So I always want to know about the personal story. How did you arrive where you are today? And also I want to find out if you're a fighter. This is a tough world we live in. We need people who can fight, who can stand their ground and take on challenges. I want to know if you can fight. And there's lots of ways to figure that out. And that's why the story is very important to me. I want to know if you faced any adversity in your life. And everybody has to face adversity. How did you deal with it? And what kind of skills do you bring to bear that's going to make a difference in terms of being part of our team, part of my team, and trying to make a difference in what we do in this world?
You know, that comment, Aaron, really reminds me of my days as a hiring manager. I think when you see candidate after candidate after candidate, resume after resume after resume, you kind of do sort of settle into, I think, often in the interviewing process on a couple of core questions that you absolutely have to have answered before you're ready to really make an agreement to take on that person onto your team. So since there are no questions at the moment from our audience, which I hope we'll have some questions from the audience coming forward. Oh, we do have a question. I'll put this question sort of out there just to the group, to anybody that would want to answer, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. What is your favorite interview question?
To ask or be asked?
To ask. To ask. As a hiring manager, to ask.
As a hiring manager.
My favorite question is, tell me your story.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one I use a lot.
Any others?
Mine is always, what is it about us that is interesting to you?
I think my question stems from that a little bit different, is why us?
I always ask, who else are you talking to?
Yeah, I do too. That's what exactly.
And that way, if they don't have any focus, it's very apparent.
Right.
That's good. All right, so we have questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Hi. I am recently graduated from college last May, and I'm working here in DC with the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and I do want to pursue a career in international trade with a development focus. But before I apply to graduate school, I would like to get some international living experience. I've never had the means or opportunity to really travel abroad, especially in the developing world, and I would think for career-wise and to get into a top-tier graduate school that would be almost essential. So what's your advice? How can I get that international experience? I've thought about the Peace Corps, and I'm still sort of thinking about it, but I'm not for certain that it's the right fit for me. So.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Katrin, I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. Katrin?
Okay. I think first and foremost, don't worry so much about top tier, second tier, third tier. Don't worry about that. That will come as you need to. I would say, and you may agree with me, Aaron, there are some excellent opportunities to get involved besides the Peace Corps. There are volunteer organizations that are rather inexpensive, that will provide housing and your meals and incredible experience across the board. I'm thinking of one in particular right now. I haven't thought of it in a while. A friend of mine was going to be a part of it, where you could go to South Africa and work in a game reserve and work in animal conservation. That's just one example. I would encourage you to check into those. There are sponsored opportunities, and that Google is a wonderful thing, you all. I love that company, and I would encourage you to really search out those opportunities, because you never know what resources are available to you and what you can do.
No, I agree. I think there's lots of different ways to get overseas. The Peace Corps is a very structured way, but it isn't the only way. And when we look to hire people in my company, we look for a wide range of international experience, not necessarily just the Peace Corps, with NGOs, with volunteer organizations. And if you can afford to spend a year at a very low salary, you can probably have a marvelous experience and gain something that's really going to make a difference in terms of your future plans in life.
The only thing I would say about this international experience, and this is only partially directed to you because I've heard this so much, is that, well, if we were just having a one-on-one, I would ask you more questions about why you want the international experience. I think, you know, it's very easy to go out, well, yeah. Remember, if you're going for an experience for you, remember that it's for you, it's not for them. So if you can keep that clear, then I think you can have a rich international experience.
The only thing I would add is, and this brings me kind of maybe to a broader point that I have found very valuable, and that is to not be afraid to talk to the people you work with about the kinds of things you might want to do. Especially you being at TDA, I know they send a lot of people overseas to work at some pretty great places.
Which I do every day. So.
Absolutely, which is fantastic, and I encourage you all to do that. I know so many people are just scared to death to let anyone in their office know that they're thinking outside the box. Well, you know, newsflash, they've all been there, done that. They're not going to be surprised if you say, hey, I love where I'm working, but I've learned so much here, and you've made me so ambitious that you kind of reflected back on them, that they're the ones who kind of brought you to a point where you want to look at other opportunities. So I would just add that as an addition to maybe some broader advice that I have found very valuable.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Shami Kulkarni. Can I move this a little bit? I mean, I can't see Ramish. My question is, I guess, directed towards Rami. We've all been talking about getting that first job and branding yourself, but I'd like to know what your experience has been as an international student after doing your master's degree here in the U.S. What challenges have you faced, and what suggestions do you have for all international students who'd like to get that first job?
I think that it's to your advantage to be international yourself, especially if you speak another language. I'm fluent in French, for instance, and I speak my, South Asian few languages and my mother tongue. I think that's an asset. International NGOs are very receptive. That's to people who already know something about other countries and have some language skills. I think in terms of longer term career, there are all sorts of complexities with not being part of the mainstream. But to start, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Did you face any challenges trying to get the first job?
Lots. I think they come later when you start getting involved in decision making. I think that's when it matters. It starts to become much more pronounced, and it becomes much clearer that it matters whether you're a foreigner, whether you're some other color, sex, whatever. But certainly in international development, I find that there's a lot more space for people from developing countries than there is for minorities, American minorities. So my concern has often been that we don't see American minorities, and certainly you see a lot of South Asians in the field, and you could answer that as well, right? I think it's very hard for women in general. It's an old school field.
And just to that point, Ronnie, I forgot to mention something earlier. Don't be surprised, and I'm speaking specifically to the women that are in this room. Gentlemen, you will forgive me. Don't be surprised when you face it on project teams and people that you work with every day. It will be few and far between, but don't be surprised. I have been surprised on occasion by project members, and they have truly surprised me. That said, that is the minority. But know how you will handle that in the future. Be prepared. Know how you will respond verbally. Know how you will respond in action. I didn't at the time. Needless to say, that is one of my great mistakes. So, but learned from it and moved forward.
I'd like to just follow on that, because I found I was always having the wrong response. Later I would reflect and think, and think, well, why didn't I speak up, or why didn't I say this, why did I say that, or why did I sound angry, or why didn't I, you know, it just, I mean, I think one just makes your way through the mistakes.
And don't let it hold you back. Use it to move forward.
Thank you.
Another question?
Sure, I'd like first to thank the panel for their time and their remarks. My name is Jeff Filler. I'm currently a student who has taken a few courses, and I have a professional experience that has moved from technology-related work into understanding kind of the international economic ramifications of some of those technologies. And my question for the panel, I was hoping to benefit from your experience. It sounds like there's a holistic sense in terms of the exposure that you've had internationally. I'm wondering, my question is a scoping question, kind of a specialization question. So I was wondering if I could hear some of the experiences and opportunities that you've had by specializing in particular cultures at the cost of being able to have kind of a broad service offering, and consequently the reverse. I know that there's pros and cons, but wondered if there were any interesting examples to discuss.
Well, let me, oh no, go ahead, please.
I think you can't go wrong having a broad base before you delve too much into specialties. I think that would certainly serve you well and be something to look for early in your career, because the broader the base, sort of the more doors that are open for you as your career develops. And certainly having a technology background, that's definitely what the market's looking for in terms of background, as someone who can, figure out how to make systems communicate around the world, how you set up systems, how you do, the way business works these days is it's always working 24 hours a day. It's like the software engineers are doing something over in India, they have it back, in time for the California to open up, which then, has it back in time. So there's projects that are going on around the world 24 hours a day, especially information technology based. So I think that's a great area for you.
I guess if I could make one slight clarification, I think I've probably been a little bit on the broader kind of generalized scale, and recognize not everyone has enough time to pursue every academic interest or geography or culture that they pursue, and just to hear. So it's more. I would agree with you. I guess I would ask some of the more specialization type of questions.
I found, it's far from technology, but I found in terms of earning myself credibility a little bit later on, because I became very interested in things like gender issues and gender analysis. I earned credibility because I had studied economics and I had worked in small business development, women's small business development. So it helped me to have that specialization. People would get uncomfortable about gender. They didn't really know what that was, but they could get a handle on economic development. So the advantage of specialization is that it helps people to place you in a way that they can listen to you. That's just the other side I would give.
I think, too, if I'm understanding your question correctly, what I would do is search for that area of specialization. You don't have to know now. That will come. Search for that thing that lights your fire. For me, it's strategy. I love strategy, but I didn't wake up to that until I started working in consulting, until I started working with large corporations that were sort of hogtied by what they did. We are moving into a very interesting era that is technology-based. And I would say, and I'm thinking of one particular area in the finance world. And if you all read a recent issue of The Economist, there's a discussion now starting about, will the actual dollar and the paper money coins go away? Are we moving to a technology-based monetary system? That's something to consider. That's a specialization. What lights your fire? What are you interested in? For me, it's strategy. I'll plan anything, and then we'll get it done. But that lights my fire. Is that addressing the question that you're asking?
Yeah, it does. I liked hearing the diverse pros to each approach. It sounds like it might be a balance of both. You know, the different experiences that people that you on the panel have sought have been maybe on opposite sides of the fence, looking at different industries, different perspectives, and then, you know, kind of being able to move up the range from high level to low level depending on how that goes, and being led by your interests and kind of the pursuit of what topics interest you. So yeah, I think so.
And I think that's the key. I think you have to remember that your career is about you. It's not about what somebody wants for you, although oftentimes we take that on without realizing it, or in some cases it's culturally driven, whether it be family, whether it be a larger culture, whatever it is. It's about you, and it's about what you want for your life and what interests you. And you won't have the picture right now, and if you do, even better, because that'll change, I promise. The plan changes, but that's when you learn to embrace that. You learn to embrace changes and opportunity when they come, and sometimes they take you in a completely different direction. And then you find yourself coming back to an original goal or an original plan a few years later. That's part of the gig.
We want to make sure we have time for plenty of networking, so I think we have time for about one or two more questions. Do you have a question, please?
Yeah. I'll be very quick. My name is Yasmin bin Humam. I'm a JD MSFS candidate at Georgetown University, and I think a lot of young people feel they're caught in this catch-22 situation of it takes experience to get experience, and so in the beginning you find yourself doing a lot of research assistance and administrative type of work in organizations that are really interesting. And how do you make that jump between sort of that jump from the entry level research and more administrative focused work to the more technical specialized work, if you do have a background in it, or even if you don't necessarily have such a specialized background in it, perhaps, yeah.
Well, that's a very good question, and you're absolutely correct. That's the chicken and the egg that everybody encounters. I think two things. First of all, you've got to do the scut work, because you're being hired to do some of that work, and we need people to do that work. Excel at it. Be sure you're the best at doing the administrative work, and let your supervisor know that you have bigger plans in store for yourself, that you want other opportunities. You want to be able to take overseas assignments. You want to be able to work on more complicated projects. You don't see yourself, because of your training and your background, as only being an administrative person. So you have to continue to push. If that person doesn't prove themselves to be the kind of supervisor that's going to provide those opportunities for you, find somebody else, find another place. Push for that opportunity, because you really have to be determined to not say no or not listen to no, and to continue to move forward. Because if you don't, you're not going to have the opportunity, because the flip side of excelling in administrative work is that some people might say they're doing a tremendous job as an admin, so therefore leave them in that job. I've had to console some of the people who work for me about the people who work for them because of that failing in their supervisory skills. You cannot allow that. It's also my job as a supervisor overlooking somebody who's supervising somebody else to make sure that we present the opportunities for our young and talented people to move up the ladder. Because as I keep telling people all the time in my organization, the most important thing we can do is find the most talented people that we can find, bring them into the organization, and give them a chance to learn.
I would say, gosh, switch jobs regularly, and each time try to find a more strategic place. I think it's very, very hard for women doing administrative work to break out of that in their own organizations. I've seen some examples, but very few. And, you know, if you end up at RTI, you have someone here who can push you up, which may be fine. But typically, it's very, very hard. I think it is important to get into an organization, but go around and meet all those people not in your department, in other departments. Have lunch with them. Tell them, talk about your aspirations, and then do so at people from other organizations at meetings, volunteer to go to things, meet people, and create your own opportunity. But if you are in one place for a long time as an administrative assistant, it's going to, even 2 years, it's going to be very hard to get out of that, I think. I don't know if you have different points of view
And
about
I agree,
that.
and I think you have to, sometimes you have to, if you like the organization and you want to stay there, they're going to like you more if you have another opportunity. And you go,
Yes.
oh my goodness, I would, love to stay here and be able to progress. So-and-so's offered me an opportunity to do this, that, and the other. And then sometimes the light bulb will go on and go, oh, well, you've been doing a good job. Maybe we can find that sort of opportunity for you. So it's important to always be out there and be prepared to make a move if you need to get out of the rut. And it's important to ask for opportunities and use leverage.
Something I did this sounds kind of corny, but and I actually kind of still do it to this day, even though I have a BlackBerry now. I don't really keep a notebook like I did, but I kept a notebook when I was having those kinds of jobs. And I would keep a list of almost every person I talked to. I answered phones. And I actually don't regret that for a minute, because I talked to a lot of people. When you answer phones all day, you talk to people from all walks of life. And you get a sense of what they do for a living, what their companies are. And I actually wrote a lot of things down. The people I talked to, maybe that person would have an opportunity for me. And that's actually how I ended up moving on from where I was answering the phones. And I think that's really important. And also in that same notebook, keep a list of things you like and what you hate about your job, what you like and you hate about your company, things that you have found interesting, things that have lit your fire along the way. Not that you can't remember those, but it's just kind of information overload when you're in a job like that. So I think you have to keep kind of a self-notebook where you can kind of escape from the day-to-day grunt of having that kind of a job and use it to your advantage to think about what your next steps might be.
Last question, please.
Hi, my name is Jocelyn Fuentes. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in international relations and ended up working in healthcare for 2.5 years. And then I've done some internships here, and now would really like to do what I originally studied and pursue international trade or international business. And I've heard all of you speak about branding yourself and switching from the NGO world to the private world to the government world. What would you suggest to someone that has absolutely no real world experience in international trade or affair?
I think just very quick, Jocelyn, what you don't know is that I graduated with a BA in International Studies,
Right.
also known as Relations in
Right.
the college that I went to. I worked in retail management for almost 2 years, just after I graduated. And it took walking away. It took choosing to walk away and realizing that while I enjoyed it, what I enjoyed was my interaction with people. I didn't enjoy the other stuff. And so I packed up and I said, thank you very much, I appreciate this, and spent the next little while looking. And through that process of looking and testing the waters, I ended up with an organization that sent me overseas. And I was there for 4 years. So I think I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues because I only remember my experience. But I'm here to say that you can do it.
Yeah.
And I think hearing what you're saying, your international relations and your healthcare experience, I think there will be a way to use that as a starting off point. But I'm going to defer to my colleagues on this one.
Sure, you can maybe find the right opportunity to leverage your healthcare experience into an international field. For instance, working with, a drug company or something like that. Because a drug company would be looking for someone who knows about healthcare, but then they all have major international operations. So if you sort of start thinking, how can you leverage your experience and your knowledge into the international field, that might provide some opportunities for you.
Anything to say about that?
No, I think that's absolutely the right answer. That you have to figure out a way to leverage what you have in terms of skill set and experience with a company that needs that and can use it in a creative way. I think it's an excellent bridge.
I think that also goes back a little bit to the question that was being asked about specialization. And I think that we sometimes make a mistake. I know I made that mistake even when I was in grad school, when you have to choose all of your specializations, your classes, and okay, I'm going to the Elliott School, but now I have to decide what is it, your concentration, or it was almost information overload for me to figure out, okay, am I really is this my brand? Am I going to sign up for this class, and this is who I'm going to be? And I didn't subscribe to that, and I still don't. And I think that we think that that's kind of the way the real world works, and it doesn't. You don't leave graduate school and sign up for your specialization and sign up for your classes, and that's it. There are so many things that are interlocked and interchangeable and can be used in other fields in ways that you have no idea until you really get out there and do it.
Great. Well, I know our audience is looking forward to continuing the conversation in our networking session. It is going to be upstairs. But please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for sharing their insights and experiences with us. And thank you all for coming out this evening to participate in this event. I look forward to seeing you upstairs.